This is our fourth, count 'em four, session of Journalism Under Siege, Truth and Trust in a Time of Turmoil. I'm Dawn Garcia, director of the John S. Knight Journalism Fellowships program here at Stanford, and co-host of this course with Michael Bolden, who is the managing director for communications at the JSK Fellowships. This speaker series is a collaboration with the Continuing Studies program here at Stanford and the John S. Knight Journalism Fellowships at Stanford. Each of the 5 nights is devoted to issues that are important to our program, the John S. Knight Fellowships, and to journalism. Tonight's class is focused on the state of local news. We think that's one of the most important sectors in the media that's supporting democracy. Here are some questions that we hope to answer tonight. Why is there an accelerated decline in the number and strength of local news organizations around the United States? What does this mean for our local communities? Where are there signs of hope? Will local news startups fill the void? And what does this mean for the state of our democracy? Failing business models and changing reader habits have decimated local news organizations in many communities. Legacy news organizations are still trying to adapt to a changing media landscape, and new business models are emerging to try to fill those gaps. Tonight we've invited journalists and media experts who are going to provide a variety of unique perspectives on this topic. The first part of the evening will be a conversation about local legacy news media with Ken Doctor, a news industry analyst, Neil Chase, executive editor of the San Jose Mercury News Bay Area News Group, and Fernando Diaz, managing editor for digital of the San Francisco Chronicle. They will talk both about some trends in local news as well as what's happening on the ground at 2 major news organizations right here in the Bay Area. We'll take a short break after the first session. Our second panel tonight will focus on some innovative models in local journalism. Our guests for that panel will be Sue Cross, CEO of the Institute of Nonprofit News, Chris Horn, a 2019 JSK Fellow and founder and publisher of The Devil Strip in Akron, Ohio, Jaquanda Johnson, founder and publisher of Flint Beat in Flint, Michigan, and Clay Lambert, editor of the Half Moon Bay Review here in the Bay Area. As we do every evening, we invite you to write your questions on index cards and pass them to the left of the auditorium to the talented and lovely Erica Bartholomew. Raise your hand, Erica. There she is. She'll collect them for you throughout the evening, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can at the end of each session. Friendly last reminder that the full syllabus for this course is on Canvas and the course website, along with biographical information for all of the speakers. We've posted books and articles and such for you there, and we've been doing that all along throughout the course. And there are now a few audio recordings up there of our classes. I want to just quickly introduce just a bit more of 3 panelists that are on stage right now, and then let's get to it. To my immediate left is Neil Chase. He's the executive editor at the Bay Area News Group and the San Jose Mercury News. A veteran journalist and marketer with deep experience in print and digital, he got his start at the San Francisco Examiner. And then he was at a Russian-American newspaper startup. And he did a stint as professor at Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism and a number of other places, the New York Times included. And he's worked as a consultant to media and business properties seeking to invigorate their content offerings in a digital age. He's a graduate of the University of Michigan, where he now chairs the school's board for student publications. And we were just sharing our love of student publications a minute ago. To Neil's left is Ken Doctor. He's a media analyst, speaker, and consultant. His work centers on the transformation of consumer media in the digital age, from the New York Times to Netflix, from Comcast to Condé Nast. He's a veteran of the digital media industry, combines deep experience as an executive in strategy, revenue models, and journalism. And he's had experience including 21 years at Knight Ridder, where I used to work years ago, and his time also licensing, corporate development, business development, and syndication. He writes a great column, which a number of us read. His major non-work commitment is to education and improving life in Santa Cruz County, where he lives. He's past president of the UC Santa Cruz Foundation, and he's a graduate of UCSC and a volunteer for many years for that university. And on the far left, not least, is Fernando Diaz, who's the managing editor for digital of the San Francisco Chronicle. Before joining the Chronicle, he was the senior editor for Reveal at the Center for Investigative Reporting, and before that, managing editor of OI in Chicago, and also the Chicago Tribune. He was, before that, he worked at Chicago Now as their community manager and a bilingual investigative reporter at the Chicago Reporter, and also local reporter at the Daily Herald and Democrat and Chronicle. So he's got a lot of local news creds. He's a graduate of Columbia College Chicago, and he's a Maryland native and now lives in the Bay Area. So without further ado, we're going to hear about legacy local news. Take it away.
Thank you. So we're going to start with a quiz. I feel like I could ask the quiz. This looks like Alexa right here. I could ask Alexa a question. I don't know what we would get. So we had one gentleman over here. You want to hold up your newspaper? We were watching who was reading what. Everybody was on electronic, and you got the Stanford Daily. There should be a door prize. Is there a door prize for it? So let's try a little audience participation to start out with. How many? Oh, number 2. Okay. Anybody else? Well, 3, 4. This is very good. 5, 6. This is very good. This is a good warm. And 7. Wait, is that a newspaper? Oh, the New Yorker. That's good enough.
Close enough.
Yeah, that's good enough. Also doing very well in digital subscription. How many of you, just raise your hands, how many of you subscribe to the New York Times? Woo! Okay, how many of the Washington Post? How many both? Oh, that's good. That's good. Now, how many of you have either the New York Times or Washington Post app on your phone? That's interesting. Okay, now we'll go local for a moment here. How many of you subscribe to the Chronicle?
Which version?
We're getting, that's a good question.
That's a great question.
Like, there's 14 versions, right?
That's right.
Is it? Okay, Chronicle again, one more time. A lot of people, okay. You,
I do.
the company pays for it though, right?
No.
No?
I live in San Francisco.
Oh, that's right. The Mercury News. Okay. So if all of America looked like this, we would have no problems. It's pretty amazing. How many of you have the Chronicle app or icon on your phone? Okay. So that's good. How many have a Mercury News icon or app? Okay. About the same number.
Not bad.
Not bad. Not bad. So I'm going to start by talking a little about.
And I don't think it should be ignored. There's a Kindle version.
Which?
The Kindle version.
Oh, the Kindle version. We could do in Kindle. We could do e-edition. Okay. Kindle version of the Chronicle. Kindle version of the Mercury News. Nope. E-edition. Anybody read the e-edition of these papers?
So our numbers tell us about 25% of people who get the newspaper in print also read the e-edition, and it looks like about a quarter of the people in the room. So that's pretty representative.
And that means they actually spend, you know how much time they spend, or that means they open it up?
So people who go to the e-edition look at a lot of pages. Often it's done on an iPad or a tablet or sometimes on the phone, but a lot of tablet users. It's so easy to flip through the pages. You know, we count page views online with the number of pages somebody sees. And it's one thing to go to your computer and look at a page, then click and go to another page. But on the e-edition, you can just flip through the pages. Same thing with the app. And so the page view numbers are off the charts, but they're not really comparable.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing.
Same thing. Yep. The e-edition, which is one of the things that I wanted to improve when I got there over a year and a half ago, and we do every day make sure that all of the articles get to the Kindle edition.
Just for you.
Just for you. Well, because it begets a question and conversation later about platforms.
Yeah.
Right.
And just how many places we absolutely need to
Yeah,
be
you have to be.
at all times. But our e-edition is among the most engaged products we produce. And the push and the pull now is that we already have those customers. And so the question becomes, well, do we convert new customers into e-edition customers, or do we convert them into website customers, or do we get them into the newsletters? And there's a lot of friction around whether you want more e-edition customers or you want to migrate those folks into the website, the full
Right.
featured experience.
But you said something about we're just going to run this conversation. You can just sit there.
That's fine.
You said something about when you got there, you want to make the e-edition better.
Yeah.
The e-edition has such potential because
Tremendous.
it's an unlimited number of pages. If you get the Sacramento Bee, I want to ask how many Sacramento Bee subscribers there are. If you get the Sacramento Bee and you get their e-edition, along with it, you get a 50-page supplement every day that has all kinds of other stuff that wouldn't fit in the paper. Full business stock tables, full sports scores, all the kind of stuff, because they can do it company-wide, the McClatchy Company across the country. It's one of those things where it's not that hard to do, and the e-edition's a wonderful place to do it because people like to engage deeply.
The other thing, and again, yeah, Ken, you can just back off.
That's fine.
No, the other thing is that the e-edition still is the tangible representation of the editor's decisions on news, and they are not driven by what clicks on the page.
Right.
So, most of my favorite stories are on A3, B4.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of readers will find that they're the stories that didn't have the necessary art, or they weren't newsy enough for a cover, but they're still important enough to include in the paper.
So you don't like your editor's choices for the front page?
He wasn't
yeah.
quite saying that, but you could intuit that.
Yeah.
I want to step back for a moment and talk about reader revenue a little and how important all your subscriptions are. So if you look at reader revenue, if you go back to 2010, there were some people in a place called Silicon Valley that said that the internet wants to be free, remember that, and that all news would always be free on the internet because that's the way God wanted it to be. 2011, the New York Times started planning what they called, what the industry has mistakenly called a paywall, meaning a subscription, and in 2011, later it was launched. Since then, about 65% of daily newspapers in the United States have paywalls. And so they're saying basically that interim between when basically 95, 96, 98, and the 2012, 2013, kind of forget about that. We kind of made a mistake by giving away all this content for free and have said to all of you, what counts is the content, not the means of delivery, and a lot of people have accepted that. Now, you can see from the hands in the audience exactly the nature of the problem. Far more people here taking the Times or the Post than taking the local paper. And this is the problem across the United States. If you look at the numbers, the New York Times in particular, which I've written a lot about, now has about 3.8 million subscribers between print and digital, more digital than print now. At the height of print, it was less than half of that. So what they've done is they've used all of what has changed to their advantage. It's still not a thriving business, but it is a business that is transitioning and making it. Similar, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, these national global papers. On the other hand, throughout the country, and the same thing is true in Europe, basically the Western world, local papers have a hard time selling digital subscriptions. They have their print subscriptions, they're declining, as all print subscriptions are, even at the Post and the Times. So this is a core problem, and the economics of it is important for everybody here who is interested in this to know. The New York Times now gets 2/3 of its revenue from its readers. You think of the importance of this, and especially in the times we live in politically, and this is the direct connection between the journalists and their readers. It's not advertisers, it's journalists and readers, 2/3. Most daily newspapers, about still maybe somewhere between 30 and 40% is circulation. The rest is still advertising. We all grew out of a world where all these newspapers, when they were thriving, depended on advertising for 80% of the revenue. So that whole world is flipped. The national people have made a transition, and the local people are still trying to figure it out. So I want to go to that question with both of you and talk about what you're doing in digital subscription consequently with that kind of framework of what are you doing and how much is changing, how quickly?
It's changing incredibly quickly.
And describe your parent company, Hearst.
So I work for the Chronicle, and we are owned by the Hearst Corporation, which owns everything from ranches to health information companies to the books that your mechanic uses to estimate how much it's going to cost to change a ball joint. So they're a hyper-diversified private corporation, and newspapers are just one portion of it. I would say also that we are behind the magazine division. The magazine division of Hearst is massive, and they are far advanced in the subscription game. They are far advanced in the digital game, in the advertorial, sort of the sponsored links game, right. Where they'll do links to products, where they do reviews. They're not affiliated, but if you buy a lipstick or a garden hose, then they get a portion of that revenue. So what we're doing is we're desperately trying to catch up, because on some level there is a limit to the number of people that we could theoretically consider converting into paying digital customers. And for every...
A limit because geographically you have a much smaller base than, say, the New York Times.
That's right. And even though on any given day we get a substantial amount of traffic, what I call the hate reads, the drudge, audience, the far right audience that just loves to hate this entire state, but specifically our publication for many things we publish day in and day out.
Mostly because the name is San Francisco.
Yes.
Yeah.
Nancy Pelosi's hometown.
That's right.
With the pastel condos.
So that's traffic, I think, in a classic sense that 5 years ago we would have been counting and saying we need to drive those page views, we need to get those impressions up, and we would have been counting drudge traffic as a good thing because it means that there's audience for that. We've evolved into understanding that it's very unlikely that we're going to convert a drudge reader into a paying subscriber. And so we need to pivot our editorial strategy to focus more on the needs and the interests of what Bay Area, what California readers primarily are interested in, because our data shows that you're much more likely to become a paying subscriber if you're geographically proximate to us.
Let me stop you there for a minute and go and then pick it up. So what Fernando is describing is what's happened throughout the industry. When he says 5 years ago you're looking for page views, meaning you want remember all these slideshows that you saw when you got on your phone and all this kind of stuff. They wanted you to consume as many pages as possible so they can put as many ads in front of you. Google and Facebook have won the digital ad war. The value of all those page views has declined, and as that's happened, what Fernando's talking about in terms of the importance of the readers, and look at this in terms of, so now it's important to really serve well a smaller number of real readers who care about the news, and if you can get them to pay for it, you've got a lifeline for the future.
Right.
And so that's the larger mechanics that's going on really all over the Western world. Now, describe a little about Hearst. We talked about this in terms of the databases. What kind of information do you know about the people who are your readers here, for instance, and how do databases and repositories work?
So if and this can be a little scary, depending on how much you don't know about what's being tracked. But literally we know what device you're on, what time of day you come to the site, what stories you read, how long you were on those stories, whether you shared them, how far you scrolled on those stories, what browser you're using, to some degree what cell service provider you have. We know general geographic information based on your IP address. And depending on, we've moved from what was the industry standard Omniture analytics platform into Google Analytics, which offers us now demographic information that is gathered based on all of the cookies that are put into your browser by all of the sites that you actually are on in addition to news. So we now know that if you're into sports or you're into food or you're into videos, we don't necessarily know that it's Bob Smith who lives at 1234 Main Street in Half Moon Bay, but we know that there's a user of this sort of like
a cohort
persona.
of people like that.
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
And so that's what Ken was describing. We will then use that information to say, okay, if they're in this geographic area and they come to our website about 3 times a week, and we've got them on email, can we convert them into a print subscriber, or into a print or a digital, ideally a digital subscriber, because we don't have the added cost of distributing the newspaper? Then that's what we're looking for. We are looking through all of our data to identify the convertibles, the people that can be compelled into supporting our ability to do journalism.
And that changes the marketing offers. So you may all get different offers based on the information that's in that database. Both and the price could change. You may be offered newsletters. How many of you receive an email newsletter from a newspaper or magazine every day? So these have turned out to be the major way that publishers are now reaching directly, and not just through Google and Facebook, readers. You're signaling that intent. The newsletters are free. That information goes in the database. Chronicle, for instance, does a really good job and a smart job around food and dining and wine, and that is one significant part of it. Let me turn to Neil, and so I know you've started your own unit in terms of digital subscriptions and using a Knight Fellow, I believe. Explain what you're doing and why.
Yeah, so as Fernando explained, he's part of the Hearst Corporation, and you've all seen Hearst Castle and remember the movies and I worked at the San Francisco Examiner in the 80s where Will Hearst III was the publisher, right? This is a family that's been in the media business forever and hopes to stay in the media business forever. We're in a different situation. We are owned by an investment firm, better known as a hedge fund, and there's some worse names for it, on the East Coast, that is very much interested in the current cash flow. Newspapers, because of all of our wonderful subscribers, we generate a lot of revenue now, and that money is a very nice kind of cash machine for the owners. They're far less interested in actually investing in the future. And so some of the tools that Hearst has, the work that Hearst has done as a corporation to move all of their papers across the country forward, we're doing that ourselves in the Mercury News newsroom. And so there's a gentleman who was a reporter for the Associated Press, was part of the Knight Fellowship program here, spent his time here researching subscription models and how subscribers will support journalism in the future. And he's now working with us, leading that effort in our newsroom. And we are trying to strike that balance between doing the stories that we know are the most important stories to do, the stories that we have to do as journalists that are important to serve our role in a functioning democracy, or a semi-functioning democracy these days, as best we can. Yeah. And doing the stories people want to read. And there are fascinating conversations in the newsroom about, well, I need to go do this story, I got to cover this meeting, and well, but nobody reads that. Well, but it's really important. Yeah, but if nobody reads it, was it really important? When we put stories in the newspaper, we think we know what people want to read. Mm-hmm. And every reporter will tell you, every story I wrote that was on the front page was read by every single person who got the newspaper that day. Because of course they all got the newspaper to read my story. In fact, many of us have the experience of picking up a newspaper and going straight to, let's say, the crossword puzzle or the movie listings or whatever else. We all use newspapers in different ways. When you start publishing online, you really understand what people want to read and what they want more of. And so it doesn't mean we only write the stupid celebrity stories. We do those because they bring a lot of people in. But we do try to focus on the kinds of stories people really want to read and the stories that the data tells us people want to read and they react to. We do a newsletter every day that gives you it gives you the sense of somebody sitting down next to you on the bus or on BART or at a coffee shop and walking you through all the day's news. And we strongly believe that the newsletter is the closest thing we have now to the old print newspaper. If you don't get a print newspaper dropped on your front porch every day, the most analogous thing we can do to that is dropping a newsletter in your email box that tells you what's going on in the newspaper. So we are within the newsroom trying to build an understanding of what people want to read, giving people more of those kinds of stories. And it's causing us to invest in more investigative reporters, in more regional stories. This will come as a shock to everybody, but we found out that nobody in the Bay Area ever has a conversation that is not about housing prices and how expensive it is to live here, and all the trailers and RVs, and I don't have to tell you, you live here.
And are you finding, like, on the investigative stuff, that leads to subscriptions? Have you figured that out yet?
We are starting to. We've benefited from being very close to a lot of other publishers and sharing a lot of information. The competition in this business is pretty much gone. We share a lot of information with each other. We have to. And we've learned from a lot of other folks who are ahead of us in this process that they've seen a good increase in subscriptions from investigative. A lot of news organizations are growing their investigative units. We do see that the local stories that have some impact do draw more subscriptions, and we're just starting to bring in a bunch of new people and kind of wrap that up.
I wanted to bring that up because I've heard from publishers around the country that as they look at the data, it is that kind of reporting and longer stories and stories that are absolutely unique to their publication that they can now associate. Neil says you can track everything. Fernando described how you track it. And look at the good news, the small piece of good news in that there are people who care about that, and that links to their money, which goes to paying journalists.
And there's a bigger piece of good news in that.
Yeah.
For 20 years, people in the newsrooms have sat there and watched the business collapse. You remember shopping at Mervyn's and Circuit City and Levitt's Furniture and Toys R Us and Sports Authority, and I could go on and on and on.
How old are you?
I'm old.
I remember.
I was at Wells Fargo when it was founded. As those businesses collapsed, the Sunday paper got smaller, right? Considerably. Those ads aren't there anymore. There was a time when if you wanted to find out what was playing at the movie theater, you either called up the theater or you picked up the newspaper. We would sneak into the composing room at the Examiner in the 80s to try to see the classified listings for apartments the night before the paper got printed to get a jump on finding an apartment in San Francisco, because it was hard. It's still hard. So that monopoly is gone, right? There are many other places to get that information. Journalists for the last 20 years have watched the business just shrink around us. And now we can say to the journalists, if we do stories people want to read, they will pay for them, and that will be a business that is sustainable long-term and will support the journalism that we're trying to do. And that's a big emotional change.
It's a big deal. So tell them what Ryan's up to.
Ryan, the guy who was the Knight Fellow here, is building a digital subscription business for us with help in the newsroom, based on understanding how people behave online, and how different kinds of people are more likely to subscribe. So one of his areas of interest is ad blockers. A lot of people use software on their websites that block the ads, which is okay. But if you're using an ad blocker, we ask you to subscribe, because now you're not seeing any ads and you're not paying us for the content. And so we're building specialized ways, all sites are, Hearst does it as well, where if you're using an ad blocker, we invite you in a different way to subscribe, maybe more quickly than we would if you were seeing some of the ads. We're doing an event tomorrow night in Oakland to talk about housing issues with the community, and he's going to be there to understand how the community interacts with us and start to learn how the people who are closest to the issues we cover consume the news and in what ways they're most likely to want to support us and subscribe.
So you can see this common thread here, and this is going on throughout the industry. And Hearst basically, maybe 2 years ago, committed significant resources in New York to figuring this out for their newspapers. Neil's figuring this out for Bay Area and what they're doing here. And when I go and talk to the Financial Times in London, they were the ones, actually New York Times copied their paywall Financial Times. They figured this out in the early 2000s. And the whole area is called propensity modeling. How likely is each of you to subscribe, and figuring that out. Now let's move to a little larger frame here and to some of the questions that Don raised, which are the pivotal questions about community, country, democracy. So if we look at overall what this change has meant, we've had huge decline in advertising. The decline in advertising is beyond belief. $30 billion a year less goes into the daily newspaper coffers than it did, now 12 years ago. $30 billion a year. So the industry is 60% downsized. At the same time, Neil mentioned all the cash that flows through the newspapers. It's not just cash, it's profits. So the profits, and I'm just running down this number, and it's an imprecise number today, but somewhere between $1 billion and $1.5 billion in free cash flow, basically profits, flow out of American newspapers still today. 1,200 newspapers left, about 100 dailies have gone away over the last decade, but they're producing $1 billion and $1.5 billion in profit. Even though the readership, the print readership is dropping 5 to 10% a year, struggling very, very much on print advertising, and digital subscription is slow to take off. So what we're seeing too much, and unfortunately Neil's parent company is the poster child for it, is what's called harvesting. It turns out that in an industry that throws off $1 billion, you can harvest a lot of money for a long time. And people, and I've written about this too much, I think, but people didn't understand that there are a lot of businesses that just do that. They find declining industries. So what we now have, and we had a report came out last Monday, or a week ago Monday, from Penny Abernathy at the University of North Carolina, who has coined the term news desert and also ghost newspapers. And she talked about in that report that just out that there are now 1,500 communities that have lost substantial news, that there are 1,800 newspapers that have closed since 2004, 1,700 of them weeklies. And then there's this map. If you go to, if you just put news deserts into Google, you'll see the map. And the map shows wide swaths of the country where there is only maybe one newspaper in an entire county. That's often a weekly. And there are a whole bunch of places where there's no newspapers left at all. Now we can kind of see the results of that in the democracy. But if we look at the Bay Area, it's a very interesting question. We have here, we have one of the most affluent, educated audiences in the world. And yet, in many of these communities, because resources have been limited, there are news deserts. So let's talk about coverage and what that means in terms of, and Neil brought up the choices that you now have to make. The staffs of these newspapers are far smaller than they used to be. The industry is not only downsized 60% in revenue, but 60% in newsroom staff across the country. About 24,000 people work in daily newsrooms, that's it. And that number was as high as 56,000 in 1990. And we have 70 million more people. So this is a bigger problem. Talk a little about your resources and the kind of choices that you have to make.
Yeah. Well, I would say, I mean, I appreciate you sharing those stats because they're true and they are alarming.
Yeah.
You know, back in 1990, it was the newspaper. That's what you had to publish. Now it's an incessant news cycle that's 24/7, doesn't let up. It's led by Washington, it's led by climate, it's led by California, it's led by Sacramento. And so you do have a much smaller newsroom at a time when the platforms are multiplying. And the ways in which people are expecting their news, now it's not just the Kindle, they want audio, right? They want to be able to listen to their news. At some point, they're going to ask their refrigerator, play me the Chronicle, right? And we need to figure that out because we need to be there, or we'll need to be there in some shape.
That's right.
And we can't go and cleave a portion of our newsroom to start an audio division, right? So we've got to find sort of what we like to call, or don't like to call, in the newsroom is just working in the margins.
Yeah.
So we try to figure out like, hey, that guy 2 jobs ago was at a radio station. You know, that gal over there, she did newsletter management at her other job. And what can she tell us about how we can cobble together new workflows, re-engineer our processes so that we can still create what we would consider to be that polished, best-in-class newspaper experience for the folks who are paying top dollar for it, while at the same time being able to populate what feels like an infinite number of new channels and at the same time still both meet our own journalistic ambition and responsibility by covering the news.
And the Chronicle staff's probably been reduced. I don't know the numbers of the Chronicle, maybe by half.
Yeah, we're at 173, 178 right now.
It was over 400 at its height.
Yeah.
It's more than half.
More than half. And so you can see all the challenges there. That's just a quick perspective of the kind of challenges of having to do more. And then, of course, you could say, well, just do the reporting. But through digital channels, you have to feed all of these kinds of products. Right. And audio, Fernando said, we like to have an audio unit. The New York Times, well, it got to where it needed to be. How many of you listen to the Daily podcast? Now, this is only maybe a year and a quarter old at this point. Amazing penetration. They didn't know that it was going to become a major part of what they're doing. The last count, they have 18 people working in audio.
Yeah.
So they recognize that. Fernando recognizes the same thing, that our Alexa smart speaker friend here will be telling us the news in 5 years. We know that's going to happen in some way because it's so easy. But if you're so resource constrained, the businesses are in a downward spiral, even though you've got editors like this and many incredibly hardworking journalists who know what to do, but they simply don't have enough resources to do it. Tell us about the kind of choices that you've had to make as you've been in your job, I'm guessing, almost 2 years.
2.5 years.
2.5 years.
It just feels like 3. We make a lot of choices every day, right? We have made some choices to stop doing some things. You have to do that in order to focus on the things you're going to do. We made a deal with our friends at the Sacramento Bee. They have a lot more people in the state capitol than we do, understandably, not just in the Sacramento newsroom, but they have a Capitol bureau in the state capitol with like 6 or 8 people. They have 2 people in their Washington bureau. They cover state politics better than we do. We have a bigger sports desk than they do, and a lot of people in Sacramento follow the Bay Area sports teams. And so the editor and I were talking, and we said, you know what, let's just trade. Take all my sports stuff you want, do whatever you want with it. I'm going to take all your politics stuff, do whatever I want with it. There's no contract, there's no terms, there's no signatures or dollars. It's just, let's help each other out. Let's share some things. So in some cases, we make a choice to share with somebody rather than doing it ourselves. We have 30 weekly papers around the Bay Area. They are, in some cases, things that we started. In some cases, they were things that we acquired over the years. The Bay Area News Group is a collection of what used to be probably 20 different news organizations. Yeah. It's the Oakland Tribune, the Contra Costa Times, the San Mateo County Times, the Mercury News, and a bunch of other publications, all kind of, the Marin Independent Journal. We're down to 3 papers now, the East Bay Times, the Mercury News, and the Marin Independent Journal. And those 30 weeklies, they have a lot of stories in them. And those of you who are looking at me with a scowl right now are the ones who get that weekly every week and don't find much from your community in it anymore, because we don't have the level of community coverage we used to have. There are 101 cities, towns in the Bay Area, in the 9-county Bay Area. There are 400 plus jurisdictions, city councils, school boards, water districts, sanitation districts, special this and that districts, sheriff's departments, police departments. To cover all those agencies the way we used to, we can't do it anymore. And so we've made some tough choices about doing more regional stories. The housing beat we created is covering the housing, not just housing in general and home prices, but one particular story, which is that for every 10 new tech jobs in the Bay Area, we've created 1 new housing unit in the past decade.
Wow.
That leads to everything we all experience every day, from the traffic to people who take a 2.5-hour train ride from Tracy and Stockton to come work in San Jose, to the people in the RVs and things that you see around here, to people making $100,000 a year, 40-year-old people living together in houses the way college students lived. And college students can't even afford to live anywhere near campus, right? So we've made a choice to cover that story intensively because it touches so many different areas of equity, of renting and owning and immigration issues and traffic and infrastructure and education at the expense of a lot of other things. We don't cover many of the large companies in the Bay Area anymore. We don't cover the earnings of most of the big companies. Lots of other people do that. You don't need us to do that. We need to take our limited resources, relatively limited. You're going to hear from some people in the next session who have far smaller newsrooms than we do and do more amazing work in their communities that we can only aspire to be able to do as well as they do. But with the size of team we have, we make decisions every day about which things to cover, how to cover something that's of regional interest, skipping something local, picking up something national from somebody else. And they're tough choices. We'd like to cover more of it, but you've got to make some decisions about what's A, most important, and B, most likely to drive people to subscribe so we have the revenue to keep covering things.
Well, let me ask you, and let me ask Don to bring up some questions. I see we have a lot of good questions, so just bring them up anytime and ask you both a question off of that. So, smaller staff, a lot of choices need to be made, too many choices. Makes a lot of sense, the kind of regional orientation, and I know you're doing the same thing. What about the smaller startups that you see? Berkeley side is one that's gotten a lot of recognition. Mm-hmm. There are a number of smaller ones in the Bay Area and across the country. A lot of them, I think Berkeley side has maybe a half a dozen people full-time.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And some, and Sue is on the next panel from INN, lots of organizations that incredibly dedicated journalists, small staffs. How much do you see that going on in the Bay Area, and can you see a world in which those proliferate and you connect with them? Is that happening in your view? Should it happen? What do you think?
You guys have a good partnership with Berkeley.
You guys
side,
have done a lot of,
Yeah.
and you've done more regional projects too.
Yeah, and I would say that the better partnership is with Cal Matters now. Mm-hmm. We're publishing a lot of Cal Matters stuff, which, to Neil's point about partnering with the Sacramento Bee, our choice was to go with Cal Matters, which is
And let me ask the audience, how many of you recognize the name Cal Matters? So relatively few, 4 or 5. Describe what it is.
So Cal Matters is a nonprofit, nonpartisan. Are they watchdog? Are they policy oriented? But they're basically doing a lot of policy coverage in Sacramento that, as Neil described, has just sort of fallen away. Mm-hmm. As everybody has pulled bureaus, pared them down. But they also have a Creative Commons open copyright policy where they want to share their content. Yeah. They want to get more reach for their journalism, and so they offer it for free. And so my counterpart in print, Michael Gray, works very closely with the folks at Cal Matters to coordinate publishing their stories in the Chronicle. So that's been one way. I would say my personal opinion is that Berkeley side, Devil Strip, Flint Beat, that's the future. The question is, what's after that? Do those smaller news organizations band together to form the regional infrastructure necessary to do larger swings like what Neil's describing, like what Audrey Cooper led with the Homeless Project, right? Because they are small, right? And by necessity have to focus on topics that they can tackle, but they can also partner, right? And you'll hear from Sue about how INN newsrooms do that. And you have a model in Panama Papers and ICIJ of doing this at a massive scale. The question is just, how do you do it organizationally?
And who does it, right? So when his boss, Audrey Cooper, reached out to papers and news organizations all around the Bay Area and said, let's all cover homelessness on the same day, it was a brilliant idea, and it got a lot of people talking about homelessness all on the same day. We have failed time and time again over the past 20 years in the large media company world to be the leaders in making new things happen. Mm-hmm. And if we fail again, it will be because organizations like the Mercury News go away and smaller startups have to scramble and fill the hole, as opposed to saying, look, we are the largest news organization in the South Bay, but we're nowhere near as large as we used to be. So we need to partner more aggressively. Professor Craig's here from San Jose State. The Spartan Daily has a wonderful staff of editors and reporters who are far more diverse than the people in my newsroom and touch every part of the community in the San Jose area. We should be using them as part of our news gathering, right? Berkeley side, all the other startups, small organizations, bloggers, the more we reach out and partner with those folks, the more we create sort of a news ecosystem that supports everybody.
Absolutely.
And we help, let's reach out to people who are doing a strong, good job of community journalism and help them do it rather than sit here and expect it all to go away or somehow, we're going to die if we don't find a new way to rebuild our business. And by the way, we're going to die before the Chronicle does because they have a real owner. Yes, this is on the record. I don't care. And it's very possible that the Chronicle will end up being a Bay Area-wide newspaper if we become too small. Right. But the better idea, right, is to have an ecosystem in the Bay Area where a bunch of journalists at all different levels, local and regional, expert and amateur, student and veteran professional, are all doing journalism all day long to get the best report we can for the Bay Area.
And what I would just add to that is one of the things that you do see in an organization like Berkeley Side is that innovation toward membership, toward engagement that companies of the size that Neil and I work at, there's a lot of layers of bureaucracy, so I give him a lot of credit for hiring to build that infrastructure in his own newsroom. But whichever way it goes, the Chronicle will not have 6 people covering Berkeley, ever, again. And neither will the Merc, or neither will the East Bay Times.
That's right.
So that's something that we also have to embrace. It's competitively, collaboratively, it's about the journalism. It's not about beating each other. It's not about beating Berkeley Side. It's about ensuring that we are holding power to account. And if Berkeley Side broke that story, then we should give them that credit. But we should also help amplify that story.
Get it out to lots of people.
We have the audience that they don't have, because we reach so many more readers than they do.
Yeah. For now.
So you see here, and this is happening basically in every metropolitan area around the country. So a lot of smaller communities, depending on who their owners are even in worse shape. And so you have a system that worked for so well, especially since World War II. And the power of that essentially monopoly daily and the reporting power it had was amazing. And the ability to have at least a couple people in Berkeley and people covering a lot of the institutions, so the 101 cities. It is broken. There are pieces being rebuilt. The pieces being rebuilt are maybe 1/10 of what was lost, and they're not connected. And that's kind of a snapshot of what you're hearing is this is going on across the US, and amazingly, our smart Canadian friends have it even worse. They have one other hedge fund that bought all the newspapers across all the provinces, and it has treated them very poorly. Let me get to a couple of questions here. I like this one. No offense to anyone in the audience, but this group skews older. Smiley face. I never see anyone under 40 reading a physical newspaper. When do you expect the physical paper to disappear? Have you looked at that? Anybody looked at that question?
Yeah. So there is a principle in making change happen in an organization that I'm going to mangle because business professors talk about it. It's over my head. But the basic idea is that you scare the crap out of people and then you show them a solution, right? Dissatisfaction, vision, and plan equals change. When I got to my newsroom 2.5 years ago, a lot of people who've been working there for a long time didn't know how small our circulation is now compared to what it used to be. Didn't know that the East Bay Times circulates more copies than the Mercury News. Didn't know about a lot of the changes that have happened in the industry. The data just wasn't shared with them, and they've been there for a long time just doing their thing. So I said, look, the first thing we have to understand is where we are. And I built a very simple chart. The circulation of the Mercury News and East Bay Times together, the two papers, plotted over the past, I think, 8 or 10 years. It has gone down every year. The number of copies goes down every year because this person's right. Nobody under 40 reads a print newspaper, very few people. They read them on campus because you're in a concentrated place where you can pick up a print paper, which is great. I have a 21-year-old daughter who consumes more news every day than I do, but never reads a print paper. We looked at the circulation and plotted it over the past 8 or 10 years and just drew a line through that. And through that line, the Mercury News in print is gone somewhere in the mid-2020s. There are no more print copies of the Mercury News. I don't know that that'll necessarily happen, at least on Sunday. I think we could sustain a good Sunday paper if it's a good weekly paper. We just invested a bunch of money to upgrade our printing press. The Chronicle just took over their printing press, and they're running it from the company that used to run it. There's still a commitment to the printed newspaper. We're going to do it as long as it's physically possible and feasible. The other thing that is hurting our circulation, not just the number of copies people are buying, is the difficulty in distributing the newspaper, which to our surprise is becoming a bigger problem than, and those of you who have a lousy delivery service are nodding at this point. I'm sorry.
Just email Neil if you didn't get your paper.
Just email Ken, he'll take care of it. Our delivery service sucks in some areas. And if you think about it, a carrier gets paid a certain amount of money to deliver a newspaper to a house. It used to be us, we were kids, right, on our bicycles and wagons going around the neighborhoods. Every house in the paper got it. You could hit 100 papers within 10 blocks. Well, now there's maybe 2 houses on the block, and some of these blocks are giant subdivisions in the southern half of San Jose. They're miles apart. It doesn't make economic sense to be a carrier anymore. And you can make a lot more money sitting in your air-conditioned car working for Uber and Lyft or working in the Amazon warehouse or whatever else. And so we're now sharing.
Your guess is 2025?
Mid-2025, something like that.
The
Chronicle will be around longer.
What do you think?
I think that print, and this is the digital guy, but I think that print also is ready for a disruption. And a lot of the conversations that we're having, because our deadlines keep getting earlier and earlier, right? Which means that ultimately you have
This is the next question. Let me add that
Okay.
to your thinking as you answer that.
Yeah.
Why does the Merc and the Chronicle give me news that is 2 days old?
Right.
So answer the deadline question.
Yeah, so part of it, I would say, and I'm not going to try to dodge this question because I think your concept of news is relative. If it's what happened 2 days later, then absolutely that's old. But if it's why did that happen, what does it mean, what will it mean, that's a different context. And I think that right now, as Neil was describing the sort of like how we make our bets and how we resource, we break stuff on the web. And if we're publishing a story in the paper that ran on the web at 3 p.m. the day before, then we're not doing our jobs, right? We're not editing. And I think that what we need to be doing is doing more analysis, more context, and that the newspaper is for reading.
You think it'll stay 7 days?
I think that
For a long
through
time?
2020, I think the paper will stay
2025? 2026?
No, I think by 2025, well, we're heading into a recession, so we'll see. Maybe it's
Right.
2020, right? Because it's all hard cost. It's logistics. If the drivers don't want to carry it.
No, listen to that. 2020. That is almost next year.
Look, the fact that a recession is coming, I think a lot of people who seem to know what they're talking about all think there's a recession coming.
Yeah.
That is going to hit hard in businesses that are already on the edge, like
tariffs-
ours. We're going to have
tariffs
to change.
hurt.
Everybody in the Bay Area wants the recession to hit before the midterms.
Right? Yeah, right? So
It's not here quite fast enough.
the tariffs, which have been on and off, and the tariffs on newsprint have hurt us. We're taking a big hit right now in the advertising related to H-1B visas. You want to bring somebody in from another country on an H-1B visa, you have to place an ad in the paper. Those ads are a lot of revenue to us. That's going away. There's a lot of change that's happening very quickly, and if we just sit here saying, gee, I hope the print paper goes on forever, we will be out of business.
So the Boston Globe is the most successful of all the regional newspapers at digital subscriptions. And tying back to what I was saying at the beginning and what we were discussing. They got about 100,000 digital subscriptions. And what they're doing is they are charging $1 a day, $365 a year for a digital subscription. By far the highest I've heard. And the owner basically has said, and he's a billionaire, John Henry, and he has said, it's the same content, we're doing a good job, we're doing all these products, and had really good people working the system. I've talked to the Globe, and I said, okay, what does it look like to you? Do you think, is print going to go away? And do you want it to go away, right? Because the question for all of us here and all of you isn't the paper as much as we may be attached to it and we like it, and of course the reporting and the content.
Right.
And so the question really is, and a lot of people ask that question in some form, will newspapers ever go away? When I'm asked that as an analyst, I say, have you looked at one lately? Because it's a shadow of what it was, right? It's still physically printed, but look at the content. The Globe has looked at this question, And the Globe would like print to go away. It is very, very expensive to print, truck, deliver, all of that, have a big building, pay all those salaries, and they would like it to go away. And so the exercise is, how do you keep the same number of people in the Globe newsroom in a purely digital product? And their answer is between 250 and 300,000 digital subscribers at about that current price, which I would hope would go up at $365, could pay that newsroom. The company would be much smaller. Now, they've done it. Some other companies have done that exercise. But as Fernando said, this could be, and we're seeing papers close this year. Gatehouse just closed 7 papers in Missouri and Arkansas. And when the recession comes, whatever it is, we're going to see a real washout. But I think it's really important for us to focus on that question. And this is a smart audience. And we know that you're all newspaper readers. You got to be smart, right? This is the question of how do we maintain the reporting. It's gotten to such a point that there is an emergency declared within our industry. And there are people talking about $1 billion fund here and $1 billion fund there to get more money into the industry, but there's no place to put it in a way that's going to sustain anything because the system today is broken. So it's a really interesting moment. I know we have to wrap up. I apologize for not getting to all these. We'd have another hour of questions. It would be good. But it's a really interesting moment, and Fernando and Neil have really given you a good portrait, I think, of on the ground, and as much as we get to in 1 hour, of the real challenges that they face and why the situation is so hard. But this is a national question, and it's now being approached nationally by some very wealthy and powerful people who see the threat to democracy and are trying to figure out what that new system, whether it's 2020 or 2025, might look like. And I would just urge you to participate in that thinking in any way that you can as we go forward. So thank you.
Thank you.